The late September sun burned low over Coral Hills, a suburb so neat it almost looked artificial. The lawns glowed green as if painted, driveways gleamed like polished marble, and the sound of sprinklers hissed in perfect rhythm. It was a place where everything, and everyone, followed the rules. Except this morning. At 7:12 a.m., the steady rumble of an old John Deere tractor broke the perfect silence. Its metal frame vibrated, coughing black smoke as it crawled down Maple Road Drive, a street meant for Teslas and golf carts, not farm machinery. Birds scattered from trimmed hedges, dogs barked behind spotless white fences, and blinds tilted open one after another. Behind the wheel sat Tom Weaver, a man whose weathered hands told the story of 3 decades spent working the soil. To most people in Coral Hills, he was just that farmer from the next county, a quiet, solitary man whose fields fed half the local farmers market. But to him, this shortcut through Coral Hills wasn't about convenience, it was survival. Harvest season had arrived 3 weeks late. Heavy rains had soaked his fields, drowning sections of corn and threatening his yearly yield. Every extra hour on the tractor mattered. The shortcut road through Coral Hills shaved 20 precious minutes off the route to his eastern plots, 20 minutes that could mean saving an entire harvest. He'd used it for years. Long before Coral Hills existed, the road had been a dirt lane connecting farmland. When the developers built over it, they paved it, fenced it, and called it private property. But the shortcut never stopped being a path between two worlds, the rural and the refined. As Tom guided the tractor past the rows of mailbox posts, he caught sight of disapproving faces in his side mirror. A woman walking a tiny dog pulled it closer. A man washing his car paused, shaking his head. They weren't used to dust, diesel fumes, or the scent of earth. To them, Tom was an intruder in their carefully curated world. And at the center of that world was Margaret Dunn, the HOA president of Coral Hills. She ruled the community like a queen with a clipboard. Her bright pink blazer and oversized sunglasses were as recognizable as her silver SUV, which always seemed to appear whenever rules were being broken. She was known for sending warning letters over faded shutters, misplaced trash bins, and even a child's bicycle left too close to the sidewalk. When Margaret saw Tom's tractor crossing the roundabout that morning, it wasn't curiosity that gripped her, it was outrage. Tom didn't notice her at first. He was focused on the road ahead, on the glint of sunlight hitting his trailer full of equipment. The gate leading out toward his fields was only a few turns away. But behind him, the silver SUV accelerated, closing the distance. Neighbors watched from their lawns as the scene unfolded, a slow tractor crawling forward and the HOA president's SUV creeping up behind it, honking in sharp bursts. Tom eased slightly to the right, giving room, though the road was narrow. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with space. She wanted obedience. Her car swerved left, trying to edge around the tractor. Then, impatiently, she sped forward, too close, too fast. And in a split second, the piece of Coral Hills shattered. The SUV's front fender clipped the tractor's rear tire, the sound of metal crunching against rubber echoing down the street. Tires screeched. Birds exploded from the trees. The heavy machine barely jolted, but the SUV shuddered, its hood crumpling like foil. Neighbors gasped. Someone shouted for a phone. Someone else was already filming. The tractor rolled to a stop. The engine coughed once, then went silent. Dust floated lazily through the air. For a long moment, nothing moved except the shimmer of heat rising from the asphalt. Margaret's car sat at an awkward angle, front end mangled, steam hissing from the radiator. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The neighborhood's queen, now the center of a very public disaster. Tom climbed down slowly, the weight of years in every movement. He stared at the dented tire, a scuff, nothing serious. But her car was ruined. Around them, phones pointed like weapons. Every whisper carried across the still air. Within minutes, the HOA faithful gathered. Some looked sympathetic, but most didn't. Their eyes said everything, how dare he bring that machine here? Margaret stepped out of her car, her expression shifting from shock to fury. Her voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and cold, echoing down Maple Row. Whatever she said, it wasn't calm. Tom stood silently, dust still settling around him. He hadn't moved the tractor in minutes. The marks on the road told the story clearly. The SUV had struck him. But in Coral Hills, stories didn't have to be true, they just had to be repeated. By the time the sheriff's cruiser arrived, the narrative had already begun to spread. Neighbors whispered that the farmer had blocked the road. Someone claimed he'd reversed on purpose. Another said she'd feared for her safety. Phones uploaded the footage before the tow truck even arrived. Clips titled, "Tractor Terror in Coral Hills," and "HOA President Hit by Angry Farmer" began circulating within hours. Tom just watched. The flashing blue lights reflected off his dusty tractor, making it look almost criminal. The sheriff took notes, shook hands, and left with no arrests, just confusion and paperwork. When Tom finally rumbled away toward his fields, the sun was setting behind the pastel rooftops. But he knew something dark was rising in its place, a storm that wouldn't come from the sky, but from the HOA boardroom. In a place like Coral Hills, truth didn't matter. Image did. And Margaret Dunn had just had hers dented, literally. The next day, Tom's name would be everywhere. His tractor, his route, his face. Margaret would make sure of it. Because for her, this wasn't just about a fender bender. It was about control. And she wasn't about to lose it to a man who smelled of diesel and dirt. When the police left, Margaret wasn't finished. By morning, the HOA would send letters, the neighborhood would take sides, and one man's reputation would be buried under paperwork and lies. Because in Coral Hills, the real damage was just beginning. The morning after the crash, Coral Hills woke up not to birdsong, but to gossip. Phones buzzed, group chats lit up, and doorsteps turned into discussion circles. Margaret Dunn's story spread like wildfire through manicured lawns and coffee cups. By sunrise, the video of the tractor incident had already hit the neighborhood forum. The post's headline read, "Farmer Endangers Residents, HOA President Struck During Confrontation." And underneath, dozens of comments poured in. "That thing doesn't belong here. What if he hit a child next time? This man should be banned from our neighborhood roads." The footage, grainy and incomplete, told half the truth, just enough to turn Tom Weaver into the villain of Coral Hills. Tom didn't see it until mid-morning. He was in his barn, replacing the damaged tire, when his neighbor's son showed him the post. There he was, frozen in time, his old tractor towering over the twisted SUV. The caption below his image made it sound like an assault. The truth didn't matter anymore. The HOA machine had started rolling. By noon, an envelope landed on Tom's porch, stamped with the Coral Hills Association seal. Inside was a notice written in the cold precision of legal English. "You are hereby cited for property damage, unauthorized use of private roads, and conduct that endangers community members." It went on to threaten legal action, repair costs, and revocation of right-of-way privileges. Tom didn't belong to the HOA. His property sat outside the gated community, connected only by that narrow shared road. But Margaret Dunn didn't care about jurisdiction, she cared about humiliation. To her, this wasn't just a collision. It was defiance. She spent the afternoon pacing her immaculate living room, her laptop open to emails sent to every resident and board member. She titled them all the same way, "Urgent Community Safety Issue." In her version of events, she had been trying to stop a reckless farmer from damaging HOA landscaping. She described Tom as hostile and non-compliant. Her tone was polished, authoritative, the voice of leadership. And most of her neighbors believed her. That night, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. Folding chairs lined the room, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and judgment. Margaret stood at the front, her silver SUV keys dangling from her manicured hand like a badge of honor. She began with a sigh, practiced, dramatic, before unveiling printed photographs of her damaged car. Every photo carefully framed to show destruction, never context. She talked about reckless rural behavior, violations of HOA safety policy, and setting a precedent for outsiders using our private roads. When she finished, there was silence, the kind that always follows authority. Then came the applause. Only one man hesitated, a board member named Alan Peters, who'd been with the HOA since it began. He cleared his throat, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, it had been an accident. But Margaret shot him a look that froze the air between them. By the end of the meeting, a unanimous vote passed. Tom Weaver would be issued a formal community fine of $3,000, and if unpaid, the HOA would seek further restitution. Outside, under the harsh parking lot lights, neighbors gathered in little clusters, whispering about insurance and lawsuits. Some felt bad for Tom, others were glad to see order restored. But one thing was clear: Margaret Dunn had turned a fender bender into a full-blown political event. Meanwhile, Tom sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter again and again. The words didn't even sound real. Endangerment. Private damage. Legal liability. All over a tractor tire that hadn't even left a scratch on his property. His son called him that night, offering to post his side online. But Tom shook his head. He'd never been one for arguments or attention. He believed in the quiet dignity of truth, that it would reveal itself in time. But Coral Hills wasn't a place where truth mattered. It was a place where image ruled everything. By the third day, Margaret had filed a police report. She claimed Tom had reversed suddenly and struck her vehicle intentionally. She added that she'd felt unsafe and threatened. Her words were crafted like weapons, each one sharpened by experience. The sheriff's office had no evidence, but they took the report anyway. A deputy dropped by Tom's farm, asked a few questions, and left looking uncertain. The system wasn't built for people like him. When the story reached the local news, it carried Margaret's version. A brief segment aired on the evening broadcast. Local HOA president injured in tractor collision, community raises safety concerns. The camera panned over the Coral Hills sign, glimmering under the Florida sun, then cut to the crumpled SUV. The reporter mentioned Tom's name once, then added, "No charges yet, but an investigation is underway." Within hours, his produce stands saw fewer customers. Contracts with local grocers began to hesitate. Even his friends started avoiding him in public. One misunderstanding, one false story, had poisoned his reputation. Margaret, meanwhile, was basking in victory. She hosted a safety awareness brunch, invited reporters, and announced new HOA policies banning commercial or agricultural vehicles from all roads. She smiled through interviews, using words like community safety and protecting our families. Behind her perfect smile, though, was fear. She knew what really happened, and she knew there was footage that hadn't been released. The neighbor across the street had captured the whole collision from his Ring camera. Margaret had already visited him, politely asking him not to share it, for legal reasons. She was in control again. Or so she thought. Because control built on lies doesn't last. 2 weeks later, Tom received another letter, this time from the county court. Margaret Dunn was suing him personally for $18,000 in damages and emotional distress. He stared at the number, barely breathing. It was more than what he'd earned from the entire harvest season. Outside, the fields shimmered gold under the fading light. His tractor stood at the edge of the property, silent now, almost like it knew it had become a symbol of something much bigger. Tom wasn't a man who fought back often. But this time, something inside him hardened. The system wasn't built for him, but he wasn't built to break easily either. The HOA could send letters. The lawyers could talk. Margaret could spin her stories. But the truth had a way of digging its roots deep. And soon, those roots would start to crack the perfect pavement of Coral Hills. When a simple accident turns into a courtroom battle, reputations crumble, and secrets start to surface. She thought she'd buried him with paperwork, but she had no idea what she'd just unearthed. The courtroom smelled like dust, old air, and nervous sweat, a place where truth often lost to performance. Tom Weaver sat at the defendant's table, his calloused hands folded together, the weight of the past months pressing against his chest. Across from him sat Margaret Dunn, immaculate as ever, draped in pastel confidence and pearls that glimmered like trophies under the fluorescent lights. Her lawyer, a man polished to perfection, stood ready with folders labeled Exhibit A, Exhibit B, and Exhibit C. Each one filled with photos, statements, and selective truths. Tom had no lawyer. Couldn't afford one. He represented himself, a farmer against a machine. The case was simple in theory but toxic in spirit. Margaret claimed his tractor had reversed into her SUV, causing damage, pain, and trauma. Her medical receipts, conveniently timed, claimed whiplash and emotional shock. Her witnesses were the same neighbors who'd whispered at the clubhouse, their words rehearsed, their tones sympathetic. They painted Tom as careless, reckless, even dangerous. When it was his turn, Tom tried to explain, calmly, plainly, how her SUV had accelerated, how the impact marks showed the truth. But as he spoke, the judge barely looked up. The courtroom wasn't interested in common sense, it was interested in presentation. Margaret's lawyer spoke like a storyteller. He crafted a narrative of fear and community safety, of a woman who stood her ground against chaos invading her peaceful neighborhood. His words filled the air like perfume, intoxicating, persuasive, and utterly false. By the time the gavel fell, Tom already knew what was coming. The verdict, liable. He was ordered to pay $25,000 in damages and legal fees. Margaret smiled politely at the decision, then turned away, her heels clicking like applause. To her, it wasn't about money. It was about winning, publicly, proudly, decisively. Tom walked out of the courthouse in silence. The reporters outside didn't look at him. They wanted the HOA president's quote, not the farmer's pain. The story that aired that night framed her as the brave woman who stood up for her neighborhood. Back home, the fields didn't care about verdicts. The corn still waited, the soil still breathed under his boots. But inside him, something had changed. The quiet patience that defined him was cracking under the weight of humiliation. He sold part of his equipment to cover the costs. Canceled orders. Neighbors who once waved at him now turned away. Even the local diners stopped buying his produce, afraid of bad publicity. Margaret had won more than a lawsuit, she'd buried his reputation. But Coral Hills didn't stay quiet for long. Because the same story that built Margaret up was about to tear her down. A young reporter from the local news station, Amber Reyes, began digging into the case. She noticed something odd. The footage that had gone viral cut off just before the collision. She requested full copies from residents, but one of them hesitated, the man whose Ring camera had recorded everything. When Amber offered confidentiality, he finally handed it over. The missing few seconds changed everything. The footage clearly showed Margaret's SUV accelerating. Not stopping. Not honking. But hitting the tractor from behind. Amber's jaw dropped. The truth was plain. And once the truth starts moving, even the HOA can't stop it. When the real video leaks, the queen of Coral Hills begins to crumble, and the man she tried to destroy starts to rise again. Because when you bury the truth, it always grows back. The video spread like wildfire, then. But this time, the headline was different. HOA president lied. New footage shows who really caused the crash. Amber Reyes' report hit the airwaves on a quiet Thursday evening, and by Friday morning, Coral Hills was in chaos. Neighbors who'd stood behind Margaret for months suddenly went silent. The same forums that once defended her were now filled with disbelief and anger. The footage didn't lie. You could see her car clearly, edging forward, closing the gap, then striking the tractor tire in a fit of impatience. Her carefully crafted empire of control began to wobble. Margaret called it deep fake nonsense. She claimed manipulation, editing, fabrication. But the metadata confirmed the truth. The video came directly from a Coral Hills residence security system. The evidence was irrefutable. Suddenly, those who had praised her leadership began stepping back. HOA board members resigned quietly. Residents who'd once feared her started talking about the fines she issued unfairly, about the petty power she wielded, about the lives she made miserable. Tom didn't celebrate. He just watched. The damage she'd done couldn't be undone overnight. But for the first time in months, people began speaking to him again. Then came the twist. The county zoning department announced an investigation into Coral Hills road design. The shortcut Tom had used? It wasn't actually private. Decades ago, it had been designated as a public easement, legally open to all traffic. including agricultural use. Margaret had fined and sued him over a road that never belonged to her HOA in the first place. The outrage grew louder. Residents flooded meetings demanding answers. The HOA's lawyer quit. A recall petition circulated. Margaret, desperate to salvage control, went on social media, calling herself a victim of online harassment. But every post she made drew more ridicule. People dug up her old HOA complaints, her selective enforcement, even recordings of her shouting at landscapers. The image she'd built, the spotless leader defending suburban order, was collapsing fast. Meanwhile, Tom returned to what he knew best, the harvest. His field stretched gold under the autumn sun. The local market invited him back. The diner bought his produce again. And when people saw him drive his tractor through Coral Hills once more, this time they waved. Still, Margaret wasn't done. Humiliation doesn't sit quietly. It festers. Late one evening, Tom's irrigation lines were found slashed. The ground was soaked, his newly fixed system destroyed. Police called it vandalism. But the tracks in the mud, SUV tires, wide and familiar, told a different story. He didn't report it. He didn't retaliate. He simply fixed the lines and went back to work. Because revenge wasn't his weapon. Truth was. But the storm that followed would strike harder than any he'd seen. Because nature and karma have a way of returning what's sown. When fury replaces reason, destruction follows. She came for his fields, but what happened next would leave her entire neighborhood drowning, literally. The night sky over Coral Hills was thick with storm clouds, heavy, black, and ready to burst. Lightning flashed in the distance, thunder echoing over the rooftops. It had been raining for 2 days straight, and the ground was soaked. Tom watched the clouds roll in from his porch, a quiet silhouette against the glow of his barn lights. He knew the ditches behind Coral Hills were clogged. They'd been for months since the HOA refused to repair the old storm drains. Margaret had blamed the county. The county had blamed the HOA. Now nature was about to make them all pay. When the storm broke, it was merciless. Rain poured in sheets, slamming against rooftops, pooling on driveways, flooding the manicured lawns. The water, trapped by clogged drains, began backing up. The decorative ponds overflowed. The streets turned into rivers. And all of it flowed downhill, straight toward Margaret Dunn's pristine home. Her backyard became a swamp. Her flower beds vanished under brown water. The silver SUV, the same one she'd used to hit Tom's tractor, sat half submerged in her driveway. By morning, Coral Hills looked like a disaster zone. Dozens of homes were damaged, fences torn down, gardens ruined. The local news arrived again, cameras rolling as residents waded through knee-deep water. But the investigation revealed something extraordinary. The flooding wasn't caused by weather alone. The HOA had ignored multiple county warnings about maintaining their storm channels. And when they built extra barriers to keep farm runoff out, they'd actually blocked the natural drainage route, the one that carried water safely away from the neighborhood. Margaret's own policy had caused the destruction. The insurance company refused coverage, labeling it preventable negligence. Damages climbed into the hundreds of thousands. And the image of the HOA president who once sued a farmer for damaging property? Now she was standing in her driveway, holding a broken mailbox, surrounded by mud. The clip went viral again. But this time, the internet sided with the farmer. Tom didn't gloat. He didn't speak to the press. He simply rebuilt what was his as always. His fields drained perfectly. His tractor, the same one she once called a hazard, now stood as a symbol of endurance, of truth, of quiet victory. Margaret tried to save face, calling it an unfortunate act of nature. But her resignation letter came days later, slipped quietly into the HOA's mailbox. Her reign was over. And Coral Hills, for the first time in years, began to breathe again. She tried to destroy him with lies, but ended up drowning in her own. Now, as the fields turn gold once more, the story comes full circle, and the real harvest begins. A year passed. The air was crisp again, the fields golden and alive. The tractor's engine hummed steady, confident, the sound of peace returning after chaos. Coral Hills had changed. The lawns were still perfect, but the people had softened. The HOA elected new leadership, humble and fair. The once feared pink blazer president was gone, moved away quietly, her house sold, her name whispered like a cautionary tale. The shortcut road was officially declared a shared access route, maintained by both the county and the farmers who used it. A small sign was placed near the gate. Public easement, agricultural vehicles permitted. Every time Tom drove past it, he smiled. He never sought revenge, never asked for apologies. The land didn't care about pride. It only responded to work, patience, and truth. And in the end, those were the only things that mattered. When the local paper finally wrote a follow-up, they titled it simply, "Farmer Wins Quiet Justice." The photo beneath showed Tom on his tractor, sunlight spilling across his face. Behind him, the fields swayed gently, endless and forgiving. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. But he had his name back. His peace. His soil. And somewhere, deep down, he knew Margaret Dunn would never understand how he'd won without ever fighting back. Because in Coral Hills, power came from rules. But out here, beyond the fences, beyond the gossip, power came from truth. The kind of truth that, like a seed, can be buried under lies, but always finds its way to the light. She hit his tractor. She sued him. She tried to ruin his life. But when nature, truth, and karma came together, she lost everything. Because in the battle between control and honesty, the harvest always favors the ones who sow right.